Today we're going to talk about adding and subtracting positive and negative fractions. So to add and subtract fractions that are positive and negative, you have to remember what you did for integers. So remember, when we were adding and subtracting integers, we always thought about it in terms of money. If it was negative, then that's money that you owe. If it was positive, then that's money that you have, right? So when we were adding and subtracting integers, we thought about it in terms of money, okay? So when you look at a fraction, actually go ahead and round it so that it's integers and estimate your answer. Okay, so negative 3 3/4, that rounds to negative 4, minus 5 4/5, which rounds to 6. So it's negative 4 minus 6. Now, when we were adding and subtracting integers, if it was subtraction, we always changed it to addition to make it easier. So negative 4 minus 6 is the same thing as negative 4 plus negative 6, right? We can squeeze in the little addition sign right there, and it becomes plus. Sorry, it's a little sloppy. All right, so negative 4 minus 6 is the same thing as negative 4 plus negative 6. Well, negative 4 means you borrowed $4, so you owe $4. Negative 6 means you borrowed another 6, so you owe another 6. So altogether, you owe $10. So your answer should be close to negative 10. Well, let's go ahead and think about the fractions. So for the fractions, we can rewrite it as negative 3 3/4 plus negative 5 4/5. Well, what does that mean? Negative 3 3/4 plus negative 5 4/5. Well, you can still think of it in terms of money. This means you owe about $3.75. This means you owe $5.80. 4/5 is 0.8. So if you borrow 3 something and then you borrow another 5 something, you're going to end up owing still, right? So your answer will be negative. If you know your answer is negative, that's the first thing you write down. Put down the negative sign so that you don't forget that your answer is going to be negative. So step 1, check the signs. Decide, is your answer going to be a positive answer or a negative answer? In this case, our answer is going to be negative because you borrowed money and then you borrowed more money. So you're going to owe, okay? Set up the problem vertically. So when we are adding and subtracting fractions, we write one on top of the other. Now, in this case, what are we going to do with these fractions? So in real life, if you borrowed 3 something and you borrowed 5 something, how would you figure out how much you end up owing? Well, you would add the 2 amounts that you borrowed, right? So ignore the negative signs and just think, okay, you know you borrowed this much and this much, so you're going to combine them. So it's going to be 3 3/4 plus 5 4/5. You can really get rid of the negative signs because you're going to combine the 2 fractions. We already know the answer is going to be negative, so we have it down here. Okay, so add up the 2 amounts you borrowed. Find a common denominator when you're adding, which in this case it's going to be 20. 5 times 4 is 20, so then 4 times 4 is 16. And 4 times 5 gets you to 20, so then 3 times 5 is 15. 15 twentieths plus 16 twentieths is 31 twentieths, and then 3 plus 5 is 8. Now that's an improper fraction, so really this is 9 11 twentieths. But you don't get 9 11 twentieths. You owe 9 11 twentieths because you're adding your debt together. This is why we had that negative, right? So it's 9 11 twentieths. You owe about 9 11 twentieths. Is that close to our estimate of owing $10? Yes, that is. So step 2 was set it up vertically. Step 3, we found common denominators, right? And then, of course, perform the operation, which in this case we decided to add the 2 amounts because that's how much you borrowed. So we added it all up, and then, of course, we remembered that it's amount that we owe, so it's going to be negative. Okay, check your sign. Is it correct? If we're owing money, it should be negative. Let's look at example 2. Let's estimate. This is about 5, and then this rounds to negative 7. So it's 5 plus negative 7, which is negative 2, right? If you have $5, but you borrowed $7, well, even if you give them the 5, you still owe them 2. So your answer should be close to negative 2. All right. So here, it's like you have 4 something, but you had borrowed 7 something. So of course, you have to pay them back, and you don't have enough to pay them back. So your answer is going to be negative. So if you know your answer is going to be negative, go ahead and put the negative sign right away. Okay. Now in real life, how would you figure out how much you would still owe them? If you borrowed 7 something and you have 4 something to give them, right? You would subtract the two amounts. Take the amount you owe, the 7 and 3/8, and subtract the amount you give them, which is the 4 and 5/6, right? Ignore the positive negative signs. Just think about, okay, in real life, what would I do to figure out how much I would still owe them? You would take the amount you owe, subtract the amount you gave them, and whatever's left over is what you still owe them. Now, when we're subtracting fractions, same thing, common denominator. The least common multiple is 24. That's the smallest number they both go into. 6 times 4 is 24, so then 5 times 4 is 20. And 8 times 3 is 24, so then 3 times 3 is 9. Now, we're subtracting here, and we cannot do 9 minus 20, so you will have to borrow. The 7 becomes a 6. If you borrow a whole, you can see there's 24 pieces in a whole. So if you borrow a whole, you're adding another 24 pieces to the 9. That gets you to 33/24. Now we can subtract. 33 minus 20 is 13, so you got 13/24. 6 minus 4 is 2. Now, you don't get to keep $2. You still owe, right? Because you paid them back and it wasn't enough. So that's why we had that negative. So you owe 2 and 13/24. Is that close to our estimate? Yes, it is. That's close to our estimate. So our answer is reasonable. And there's your answer. Last example, okay? This would round to negative 13, so that's like negative 13 minus negative 5, right? 4 and 5, 6 rounds to. Now, when you have two negatives, what happens? It becomes plus. So that becomes negative 13 plus 5, which if you owe someone 13 and you have $5 you can give them, you still owe them what? $8. So our answer should be close to negative 8, right? These two negatives become plus. So if you owe someone 12 something and you give them 4 something, you still owe them. So our answer is going to be negative. Put our sign down right away. How do you figure out how much you would owe them? Well, you would, I'm going to do this on the side because I'm running out of room here. You would take the amount you owe and subtract the amount you just gave them. So you owe them 12 and 3/5, but you're giving them 4 and 5/6. So subtract the 4 and 5/6 that you're going to give them, and whatever's left over is the amount you owe them. When we're subtracting, we need common denominators, so it would be 30 for 5 and 6, times 5, so then times 5, that's 25, and then times 6, 3 times 6 is 18. We cannot do 18 minus 25, so you have to borrow. The 12 becomes an 11. If you borrow, you're adding 30 more. If you borrow a whole, you're adding 30 more pieces because, look, 30 makes a whole. The denominator is 30. So you're adding 30 more pieces to the 18, which makes it 48. 48 minus 25 is 23. So you're at 23/30. And 11 minus 4 is 7. But it's not positive. So you owe, this is how much you still owe them. So you owe 7 and 23/30. Is that close to our estimate? Yes, it is. So that is a reasonable answer. So when you are adding and subtracting positive and negative fractions, you still think of it in terms of money, right? Look at it. If you owe more than what you have, you're still going to owe because you don't have enough to pay them back. So in these cases, you owed money in all of the cases, right? So there were none where you actually got to keep any of the money because you had more negatives than positives when you were adding, okay? So think of it in terms of money, right? And don't forget to find a common denominator.